Oops. All right. Thanks everyone for being here. Again, my name is Mina. I'm with Upright Consulting, and we're really excited today. On this month's Community of Practice, we have Rosa Gonzalez, who I will let introduce herself in just a minute. So this call is one of our monthly calls that we have to support folks who are using the GreenLink equity maps or are interested in thinking about how equity data can help us move on climate action, to want to address climate and address racial equity. And so the GreenLink equity maps is one of the really wonderful tools that we have at our disposal to do that work. And so I think probably most of you on here have used the maps before or are familiar, and some of you might be new to that. So hopefully this can be a good intro to those of you who haven't quite gotten into the maps yet. So we do these calls every month. We have about 400 or 500 folks who are signed up who come every month. And it's really a way to help people do that, do the work with the equity data and also support each other. So we want folks connecting with each other and seeing who else is kind of doing this work. We also have a core kind of team of folks who are helping put together these offerings that we do every month. And some of those folks are here. We've got Rosa and Jelly, and I know there's some more. I think I saw Dee. So we're really excited to have them here today and continue to kind of make these resources more and more applicable to the work that you all are doing to address climate change and racial equity. And we also have some folks here from GreenLink Analytics. We've got Matt and Jelly. And so as questions come up in the chat around the platform or GreenLink offers, they'll be here to address those. So I am going to pass it over to our host and fearless leader, Rosa Gonzalez, of Facilitating Power, and put our question in the chat to start off the conversation today.
Thanks, Mina. Yeah, I would love to hear, good to know that there's newer folks and folks that have been a part of this community of practice. Just giving us a little bit more context, and also for yourself kind of grounding in like, what am I here to gain in terms of community of practice? So sharing in the chat anything you want to say about yourself, and then what context are you using the GEM data, to what end? And then what questions are you holding with regards to collaborative data analysis? You may have noticed on the GreenLink website or been shared via email, a process guide that goes with the GreenLink equity maps. Mina and I developed that process guide along with input and guidance from the rest of the core team to really support city community collaborations, to analyze the data in the maps collaboratively as a way to help advance local equity goals. So thinking about that, take a moment now to share a little bit about your context. And any questions you're holding about that collaborative data analysis between community groups and city or county staff. Let's give folks another minute. If you're just joining, we're introducing ourselves in the chat and sharing a little bit about the context in which you are or will be using GreenLink's equity maps. And any questions you're holding about collaborative data analysis. All right, so as folks are formulating their chat introductions, I'll go ahead and share our agenda for today. Relevant to the chat question here, we want to, our purpose is for the data and these maps to not just sit on some people's desks or on some people's computers, but to really be collaboratively used to advance equity goals locally. And so that's the purpose that guides a lot of the work of the core team. And that process itself of collaborative data analysis can help build capacity locally to be able to align around and collaboratively advance racial equity goals. So our objectives for today, we want to unpack part of the GEM process guide. That guide is just chock full of tools and insights and process points, which can be awesome and also could be overwhelming. There's so much in there. And so we wanted to unpack a little bit of it. And also the spectrum of community engagement to ownership, which we used as part of, as a way to sort of guide the process points that are included in the guide. And as we sort of unpack the spectrum and how it's relevant to collaborative data analysis, we'll have space to sort of collectively brainstorm methods and practices along the spectrum that you can engage in your own work locally for equitable data analysis. Still not seeing any responses in the chat. Maybe folks are taking some time to think about it, but really want to make sure that you have a moment to sort of connect with what's the context in which I would be using this data, and what are some of the questions I'm holding when it comes to being able to analyze, make meaning of the data in a collaborative way.
We've got some good responses here. We've got a lot actually.
Oh, I can't see the chat.
Yeah, I think it's a screen thing, but we heard from Albert, we heard from Aaron in Columbus, we heard from June in Portland, Juliana at IMT, Sela.
Okay.
So.
Oh, I can't see the questions. So,
okay.
Or the thoughts. Oh, wait, maybe I can. That's so weird. Yay. Okay. So, wonderful. Thanks, you all. Co-creating an equity index. Just learning more about GEM generally. That's great. From a community organizer perspective, how the GEM maps can help with more targeted community engagement approach. Nice, to help shape, support, and solidify the narratives of people's lived experiences. Excellent. City of Portland, how can we use mapping tools to target outreach in areas for climate projects led by frontline communities? Wonderful. Yeah, and you'll find that some points around that in the process guide, June, to really, your first step is identifying who are our most impacted communities that we want to have at the center of collaborative data analysis, collaborative setting of equity goals. And so using the maps as that starting place to really identify what are the communities with whom we need to partner, and how can and who are the community-based organizations within those communities that we can start partnering with from the start. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Wonderful, y'all, thank you. So, holding that context in your mind as we go through the rest of the content today. And we'll continue to use the chat, as well as if you would prefer to unmute and speak, then we can use the hand raising function. So wanted to first just, not assume that we all are thinking the same thing when it comes to equity, and not just throw the word equity around. And it's always good, no matter how versed we are in the process and practice of equity locally, to kind of come back to how do we define that in our own words? And so let's use the chat again. How do you define equity? If somebody's say, what do you mean by equity? What would you say? Great. Resources and assistance provided on a need basis, not the same for everyone, since some will need more than others. Great. Aiming to close the gaps through a localized look at how folks are differently situated. Great. So the data helps us to understand how folks are situated differently. I often think of redistribution or reallocation elements of equity work, acknowledging and recognizing that we operate today on a very uneven, unequal platform that was intentionally designed as such. Beautiful. Equity means fostering the conditions necessary for those most impacted by an issue to be at the center of its solutions. Equity is acknowledging that due to past and current systems built upon racism and intentional discrimination, that certain communities lack access to resources that influence certain determinants of health. So having a structural analysis of why people are faring differently and recognizing the reparative work that needs to happen, making it possible, ensuring identity, race, for example, is not a predictor of quality of life outcomes, making it possible for people to thrive, have access to deep self-determination. Beautiful. Sometimes we don't think about that cultural. It's not just about, resource allocation is critical, but it's also about like, how are we thriving, recognizing and addressing systemic harms. Beautiful. So something that you can see in people's descriptions, and maybe we can make sure to share the chat with folks, because it's always nice to, people have just contributed really powerful ways of talking about equity. But there's an element within, a really sort of core element within equitable practice that is about the redistribution of power. And a couple of folks have, in acknowledging the structural realities that have resulted in current inequities, those structural realities are really about the concentration of power and resources in the hands of a few. And as a result of white supremacy and capitalism, it has, that sort of concentration of wealth and power has been along racial and class lines. And so our work within racial equity is to redistribute power within and among our communities that have been historically excluded. So having a power analysis within our equity work is critical. And I hear that in what folks have shared. So, many of our systems are sort of designed to concentrate power and wealth at the top, and the shift towards more equitable outcomes for impacted communities is about a shift in how power is distributed to more shared, more distributed models of power. And so when we say power, and this is, you could hear it in some of how you described equity, what do we mean by power? Again, continuing using the chat, start unpacking some of these terms that we throw around. How do you define power in this context? Having autonomy and decision-making agency. Beautiful. Money and decision-making. Some organizers talk about organized money and organized people. If we don't have the money, then we need the organized people to be able to push systems in the direction of justice. Advantage, resources, connection, the power of access, choice, affordability. Yeah, we know that self-determination and resources to live a healthy life, beautiful. Influence over decisions and policies. There's a incredible book by Cindy Suarez, who's now the editor-in-chief at Nonprofit Quarterly, but she wrote this book called The Power Manual, which is awesome, and really clearly breaks down sort of dominant power as sort of, command and control, and then liberatory power as like our capacity to affect change. And I think we could add transformation as well, because when you described equity, you were talking about a societal transformation, right? And that also requires us to transform. And so there are folks, particularly within the realm of cultural power, who have helped sort of unpack, when we think about power, it's not just political power, right? Political power is usually what we think about when we think about power. It's what for many, it can be what first comes to mind. But as you could see from some of your definitions, it's also economic and it's also cultural. And so thinking about folks at Movement Strategy Center have sort of broken each of these down, and thinking about political power as the capacity to define the rules. And that's why our access to centers of decision-making power are so critical. Cultural power as the capacity to define reality. We know Hollywood has tremendous cultural power and puts forward particular narratives that can tend to dominate. Anyone sort of controlling the narrative. And yet we see within our own communities, folks, particularly within the arts, but in many realms, cultivating our capacity, let's say at a local level of, particularly impacted communities to have control over their own narratives. And then lastly, economic power can be defined many ways. One simple way to think about it is to define the capacity to define relationships. Our relationships to one another, are they based on exploitation, or are they based on mutuality, reciprocity? Our relationships to the land, to our resources, how we manage our resources. And so, the GEM, the GreenLink equity maps are about arming our local communities and local governments with
Rosa, I think we lost your internet.
Oh, am I back?
Oh, you're back. Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. So when we think about the data and we think about collaborative data analysis, what is the power within that? What power are we talking about when it comes to collaborative data analysis at the local level? We know there's so many aspects of the work of building towards more equitable outcomes. When it comes to the analysis of equity data, what's the power held within that? The power to characterize the world in a way that actually represents it. Yeah, data can be defined, we can make meaning of the data in so many different ways. And so for that, the power to make meaning of our local data is the power to, as Dave said, the power to characterize the world in a way that actually represents our lived experience of it, or a community member's lived experience of it. Bethany, defining what constitutes as data. So we know that is culturally determined, right? Universities have a certain way of thinking about data. Government has a certain way of thinking about data. Bethany's offering this distinction between qualitative versus quantitative. And ideally both are working hand in hand. And we know that when our communities define what data means, it is often rooted in lived experience. And so more on the qualitative side of really giving a more nuanced understanding. When those two work hand in hand, and you'll see that come up a lot in the process guide, the power of lived experience, storytelling, people's lived realities, combined with, the helpful thing about the numbers side, the quantitative side, is that it helps to demonstrate patterns across multiple lived experiences. But if we only look at the patterns and we don't actually have the lived experience to complement and make deeper understanding of it, then we can be missing the boat and missing a whole community's way of thinking about the data. Lisette, good point. Who's doing the analysis? So as you all are sort of armed with this incredible data set that GreenLink is providing, the choice about who is doing the analysis and being really choiceful about that from the start. Albert, data can show a limited snapshot of reality and may not show the overall experience of a community. Beautiful. And so thinking about ourselves sort of as editors of the narrative, who is included in the data analysis process will determine to how big of a snapshot, how clear of a snapshot, how deep of a snapshot we're providing of the experience of a particular community, or that we're cultivating together. One of the things you'll see in the process guide is this encouragement towards an ecosystem approach to racial equity. I love that when you look at this graphic of more distributed power, it forms sort of a symbol of an ecosystem. And in ecosystems, every player has a critical role to play and in dynamic relationship to the other players in that particular system. We see that within our ecological systems and also within our social systems. But sometimes we forget how deeply interconnected we are with each other, with each other's work. And so the more we can acknowledge, honor those deep interconnections and also activate them towards those fundamental shifts that you described when you defined equity. And so, an ecosystem approach is really about creating the conditions for communities that have been historically excluded to move from the margins to the center. It's about decentering government as the only actor, but really getting to real role clarity, because government has such a critical role to play. Community-based organizations have a critical role to play. And so one of the things that we offer in the guide is a breakdown of, sort of a snapshot of what are some of the critical roles that each player, and this is not a complete list of all the different players in your local ecosystems, but some that may be critical to your equity work. And encouraging folks to take that time to really reflect, what is our unique role within this larger equity ecosystem, and how can we really play that role well in relationship to the other players in the system? And seeing Kirsten's comment here, data is another form of power, right? Data is cultural power. It's part of how we define reality. And too often communities, as Kirsten is saying, most impacted by inequities may not have data, but they have the lived experiences and know what most impacts their communities. It's just too often they are ignored or discredited. Well said. So that's really what Kirsten is pointing out is really the purpose of the spectrum of community engagement to ownership, is to bring more of us in to this larger effort to rectify the harms of the past that have pushed communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, migrant communities, the disabled community, queer communities, pushed to the margins and brought more into the center, because we know that those closest to the problem are best suited to one, understand the problem, and two, to prioritize the kinds of solutions that are most effective, most relevant, et cetera. And so what the spectrum does, it's partly, one way to think about it is it's about redistributing power through a depth of participation, and really rethinking how our systems define participation, and taking a cue from grassroots organizing around what deep participation actually looks like when people, as folks have described beautifully in the chat, are able to have self-determination and autonomy over our own realities. Each stage of this spectrum can be used in multiple ways. I think on face value, it seems sort of like an evaluative tool, and organizations and local systems can use it in that way to sort of say, where are we along the spectrum? And the more you do that sort of in partnership with impacted communities, the better, because those of us within a particular system may have one idea of where we're at along the spectrum, and then those whose our work impacts may have a different understanding. And so it's powerful as a shared evaluative tool to say like, wow, we're really at a 1 in terms of, we focus most of our resources on information, one-way information sharing, and we want to be at a 3. And what will it take for us to get there? So it can be used in that way as an evaluative tool, a reflection tool. And it can also be used as a planning tool. And as a planning tool, it's less about evaluating where we're at and more about how can each of these stages along the spectrum give us a cue about how we can move from marginalization to community ownership. So even a 0 on the spectrum is valuable in the sense that we need to understand and acknowledge and not just ignore the generations of marginalization and exclusion, but instead learn from it and take time to understand what are the barriers to participation that our communities face, and how can community strengths help us navigate and overcome those barriers. Information sharing is sort of foundational for effective participation. And so really like honing in on the power of information and all the way along the spectrum. The other thing that the spectrum does is the final stage is community ownership. And so this recognition that if we are truly committed to those fundamental shifts towards equitable outcomes for all, then what we're building are the conditions for community ownership. As folks named, the capacity of communities to have a direct say over what we need to live and thrive. And so holding that as our North Star, how are we throughout, even if our organization or agency is at a 1, how are we doing information sharing? And the data is clearly in the role of a 1. How are we doing that in a way that is actually building capacity towards community ownership? So in the process guide, we include a version of the spectrum, and we add this additional column that is looking specifically at the spectrum as a planning tool and applying it to collaborative data analysis. So that's what we want to jump into now, is sort of looking at each of those sort of stages along the spectrum and how they can inform and help guide our efforts around collaborative data analysis to ensure, as many of you said, that we are not ignoring, marginalizing the people whose lives, whose lived experience the data actually it represents. So starting at that first stage of marginalization, really important to me that the spectrum start there so that we're acknowledging, like I said, decades, years, hundreds of years of marginalization, particularly on the basis of race. And so, when it comes to the data, if we are to perpetuate this legacy of marginalization, then what we would do is simply fail to share the data or engage community partners in analysis of the equity maps. And, something that might hit you, depending on where your position is, how easy it would be to simply fail to share the data or engage community partners in the analysis of the equity maps. That would be the easiest thing to do. And there is a lot in our culture, in our systems, that is sort of pushing us in that direction. So just to recognize how easy that would be, because marginalization is the default of our current systems. What message does that send to communities? That our voices don't matter, our needs and interests don't matter, et cetera. And so marginalization can be systematic and intentional, as some people named, and it can also simply be, maybe it's not one's intention, but because our systems are so well designed to exclude our communities, it can just simply happen by default. And so we have to actually sort of push ourselves to ensure that we're not replicating and perpetuating those patterns. So when it comes to planning for collaborative data analysis, here's some questions I wanted to offer that we can ask ourselves, ask within our teams, ask in partnership with, ask within community and system partnerships. So one is, how can we acknowledge the ways in which communities have been excluded? To simply ask that question, I think it is really powerful. I'll share just brief examples from my own local work in Salinas, California. And also we'll open it up at each stage along the spectrum. I'll just share brief examples and then open it up to other folks' thoughts. Please feel free to keep using the chat and also raise your hand if you would prefer to unmute. So I have not yet seen, I know it has happened. I know it has happened in other countries like New Zealand, where there have been real, sort of within local or even federal government, formal acknowledgements of the ways in which communities have been excluded. I have more seen it done really well by community-based organizations as part of the, some folks refer to it as healing work, but some of the deeper sort of healing work that needs to happen in order to actually organize within communities that have been marginalized. Acknowledgement is an incredibly powerful sort of healing balm. And so to be able to create space for people to acknowledge that the reason why the problems are the way they are, the reason why we experience, as opposed to putting self-blame, to acknowledge the systemic realities that have resulted. And then, for planning purposes, acknowledging what are the barriers and really getting clear, what are the barriers our communities face to participation? And then how can we draw on community strengths to overcome those barriers? One quick example, I was recently doing advising with the Santa Clara County water district, who's developing a whole water treatment plant and really wants impacted communities to participate in the process. And they said, well, some communities are just hard to reach. Like, should we just accept that they're just disengaged? And so we had a conversation, well, what are the actual barriers that people are facing to participation? It's not that they're disengaged or don't care about the thing. And so we talked about the economic barriers, the realities of people working multiple jobs. When are they going to be able to come out to the site? And we talked about multiple barriers. But then this second question is really important. How can we draw on community strengths to overcome those barriers? So, for example, in the community, one of the communities that they're focused on, there's a really powerful community-based organization who they reached out to, who said that, water is not one of their priorities. So well, what is the priority of that particular organization? And it's early childhood literacy. And so thinking about the engagement about the water treatment plant, what if that's done as part of a literacy campaign that's about understanding the water cycle and actually creating a children's book about how we can activate the water cycle as a way to clean our local water and make our water systems more ecological and reactivate the power of the water cycle. So always following up that question about barriers with the strengths, because it's in the strengths of how we can overcome those barriers. Information sharing. So in the spectrum, it's characterized as either preparation for participation, or as placation. So it becomes placation when we simply stop at information sharing, and information sharing is just one way from systems or organizations to community members. It can, oftentimes the way in which information is shared, particularly if we're coming at it with a victimization mindset, can sort of put the onus of responsibility simply on the individual community member, and not uncover sort of the systemic shifts that are needed and the redistribution of power that's needed, et cetera. And that's when it sort of defaults into placation. But like we said earlier, information sharing can be such a critical and really empowering and just a powerful way to prepare people to participate. We were talking about patterns. When people are able to see, oh, my lived experience is actually part of a larger systemic pattern, that's a point of activation, and it can be an invitation into participation. So seeing in the context of collaborative data analysis, just simply the effort to ensure that the public has access to the data in the GEM platform, sharing that data widely through accessible channels. If that's done in a way that is grounded first in an analysis of what are the barriers our target communities face to participation, and what are the community strengths that can help overcome those barriers, that analysis directly can inform the ways in which you share the data, the types of platforms you use, the types of messengers, really looking at who are the authentic messengers within our communities, who are the artists. In Salinas, where I live, the community groups that I work with have done a lot of using theater as a community, and popular theater as a form of information sharing. And we'll do sort of building off of the tradition within Chicano theater to bring community theater on the back, like a flatbed truck through the neighborhood, or within rec centers, creating documentary theater that's based on the lived experiences of folks, but also includes sort of like data and showing those patterns across the lived experience has been really powerful. Using bilingual radio, radio bilingüe is really popular within the farm worker community, and doing radio theater about issues that are impacting the community have been really powerful methods and also channels for data analysis. So question to you all, thinking about communities that you're accountable to, what information sharing methods are most relevant and accessible to your communities? And how can we partner with artists and community groups rooted in impacted communities to engage more creative and culturally relevant methods? Sorry, we're sort of jamming through these, but please, as these questions pop up, reflection questions, as thoughts arise, please feel free to put them in the chat, or questions that you want to frame as well. Yeah, Erica.
This is so exciting to hear this perspective come from a colleague doing this work. Some of the ways that we here in Atlanta are communicating with our community is by letting communities speak for themselves. I mean, sometimes I think we overthink it, but it becomes just that simple. And in the spaces that we hold, we being a collective of grassroots organizations like the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance or Eco Action, holding the space so those voices can be heard. And so we've just been very clear about our role in not speaking for community that we are serving, and we're also very clear that we are also part of the same community that we serve when we look at our data demographically. And so I think a lot of us who do this work from the front lines also find ourselves as part of the same data set that we're looking at or analyzing. And I think that that's important, because when we say communication, a big gap that I see comes in the communication around conclusions drawn from the data. And where I don't see a lot of space in communication is the places where the voices of community and most impacted can also hear the conclusions drawn from the same data set. Why? Because I see myself in the data gaps all the time, because often these studies that we look at aren't coming from a perspective that has included us from a perspective from the beginning. So Here we're really uplifting not only everything that you said, that lived experience, but really understanding the roles of organizations like WAWA and Eco Action and holding space and trainings and being that conduit for that next level.
I'm so glad you unmuted, Erica. So much wisdom in what Erica just shared. The first thing that you said was we could have the tendency to overthink it. Let us not do that. Let us let community members speak for themselves. And that recognition of the role that community-based organizations play, not only in this specific work that we're talking about here, but in our local democracies overall, in creating those kinds of culturally relevant, respectful, relational, life-affirming spaces where folks who have been most impacted by the issues that we're talking about are able to voice not only their lived experience, but as Erica said, an analysis of it to draw our own conclusions is just fundamental. We don't get that in our schools should be playing that role in our democracy, and often they're not. And so the role of community-based organizations is so critical. And why, you know, particularly for our local systems, why it's so important to, from the very beginning, as Erica said, at the very least, consult with those trusted organizations within impacted communities, not just around, you know, the content, but the methods. How are we engaging folks in ways that are going to honor who they are, the reality? And, you know, something Erica said, as grassroots organizers, we are often of the community that we are working with and organizing and have experienced the same things. And so just recognizing like that there's harm that has been done and that we need space and to like acknowledge that and not sort of overlook or override the sort of healing work that's needed to simply acknowledge what folks are living on a day-to-day basis. And so for planning purposes, the earlier in the process that our local systems, if local, ideally from the beginning, communities are driving this entire process. But for those who are working within systems, the earlier you engage community-based organizations like WAWA in the process, the better. Because part of what we're building to in this stage along the spectrum of authentic community voice and power is really where the process guide is focused. So, and all of those other stages along the spectrum are helping to build the capacity, that healthy and equitable flow of information, data, stories, the you know, consulting and being guided by those organizations most rooted in the community. All of that clarity about what are the right methods for our community. All of that really supports and is necessary foundation for authentic community voice and power. It is such a big, it is a leap of faith to have trust in a process for somebody who has experienced generations of exclusion to actually take that step to participate. We need to honor that the best way possible and make sure that people's needs are met, that people are treated with respect, and that the spaces we're creating are ones in which people's lived experiences value, people have the space with their peers to analyze their own realities. And so one form of that, you know, some groups use people's assemblies, in the Spanish-speaking community, asambleas populares, but public forums, community forums, where that really center the lived experience of impacted residents, where residents have a space, a brave space, a connected space, a relational space to raise their voices, develop their own analysis around the equity data. Any local systems looking to do that, really, you know, the recommendation is to help resource community groups to be able to hold their own spaces. or to, at the very least, do that in collaboration with. And so why is it critical that we're investing in and cultivating these kinds of spaces? How does this kind of approach to collaborative data analysis contribute to our overall efforts to advance racial equity goals? Taking a moment to reflect on that. It's not just because this is, you know, the right way, or but how does this kind of a forum, a space that Erica was describing, why is that so critical to the overall effort to advancing racial equity goals? Some obvious ones, we know those most impacted are best to define the problem, to help us understand, to help us collectively understand the reality. Also to be able to assess and prioritize the right kinds of solutions, to set goals together. And then, as Dave put, it promotes individual empowerment. We need this effort. If you look back to how you are describing equity and that fundamental shift, that is a collective and societal effort that has to be led by those communities most impacted. And so our whole process of understanding inequities, of setting equity goals, needs to be led by those folks. And so we need to be creating spaces that reflect that necessary process, and that rethinking of what power looks like, redistributing power to those who have been historically disenfranchised, like that is fundamental. And we can do that right from the data analysis. Like every part of the process is critical to that reconfiguration of how we relate to one another. Collaboration is sort of the fourth stage along the spectrum. It is both incredibly powerful for and, you know, sort of one of our important, it's not an end goal, but it's an important stepping stone along the way towards, you know, community governance, community ownership. That collaboration between institutional power and grassroots power, it can help spark the culture shift that's needed within our local systems to be more accountable and driven by our communities. Our local systems can't make those shifts on their own. They need to do that in partnership with grassroots groups. And so collaboration can be a powerful way to do that, you know, through MOUs with community-based organizations, through citizen advisory committees, the collaborative planning, collaborative decision-making. And there are also many pitfalls within collaboration as a result of the existing uneven power dynamics. And so it takes real work on the part of both systems and grassroots groups to be at a place where we're ready to collaborate effectively. And so all those other stages along the spectrum help build that capacity to be able to collaborate effectively. Whoa, went all the way back to the beginning here. Let me see if I can go this way. Nope. I'm just going to flip through these really fast to our last couple of slides here. And invite any reflections on collaboration. What does it take? How can we ready ourselves for equitable collaboration? Not sure how the slides went all the way back to the beginning all of a sudden, but we're almost back to our spot at the last couple slides here. What does it take for us to work collaboratively across systems and community partners to design data analysis processes that meet city and community needs and support ongoing collaboration to address inequities. Something to reflect on. How can we ready ourselves for that? And then lastly, like we said, the last stage along the spectrum is community ownership. That's our North Star when it comes to those fundamental shifts towards equitable outcomes. I want to make sure we don't miss what Erica put here. This is the 10-year anniversary of the People's Movement Assembly. For those of us in the South, the Southern Movement Assembly just held their PMA organizing intensive. This is where this year science data is placed in the hands of the people. Beautiful. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Grassroots movements have been designing these kinds of spaces that are, really, as Erica said, putting the data in the hands of the people to make meaning, analysis, and to set forward their own goals for equity and justice. And thinking about 10 years under the belt of that particular movement in the South, pretty awesome. Jeremy, I think equitable collaboration requires staff and local government to be aware of power imbalances. So this is why, and we don't want to overemphasize the role of training within local government and sort of stop there at sort of like doing racial equity trainings. Those are important to the end of transforming how we actually do our work and how we partner with communities. So really thinking about it strategically in terms of how am I learning and how am I unlearning all of those sort of messages about how power is wielded, how change is made, and sort of relearning the sort of practices and understanding that are rooted in more shared power models. Beautiful. And then I think part of what's really critical for, so first just saying a community ownership approach is, really what Erica was just describing. Community groups resourced to design and implement their own data sharing and analysis process and to advance community-driven solutions and to invite local systems in as partners to help advance those. And community ownership is also about the shift towards greater ownership within impacted communities of the resources we need to live. So greater ownership, community ownership of land, of our food systems, of our energy systems. And so collectively, we can help make that shift from the beginning of the process, holding this North Star. How can we seed in the capacity needed, the resourcing shifts, et cetera, towards that shift as well of actual ownership of what we need to live. So ownership is both in the process, but also in terms of the concrete outcomes of our equity work. So in our last, thank you all for your participation, your patience with the slides. And just wanted in our last couple of minutes to see if we can just get some final reflections here. What's one insight from this session? Thinking about what each other shared, thinking about some of this content that we just shared from the process guide. One insight that this session offered that was relevant to the context and the questions that you identified at the beginning, whether you put those in the chat or not, and feel free to add those to the chat or unmute, and hopefully we get a little flurry of insights in our last 2 minutes. And Erica had already started us off with, we are the data, I am the data. Yes. Recognizing data not as this abstract thing that lives out here, but as one way to represent lived experiences. Question, does ownership also include the data platforms that often hold hostage, meaning having to pay for the data that are our lived experience? Whoo, yes, it does. And that's part of our collective work to make sure that impacted communities have direct ownership over their data. June, to not overthink collaborative data analysis in a way that stops it from being done. Oh, that's the ultimate. Thank you so much, June, for saying that. Let us not overthink it. Our goal today was sort of to demystify and bring us back to the basics, bring us back to that human level. Awesome, Emmy. Powerful pieces to inform your food systems work. Centering the leap of faith that folks impacted are taking to engage with city. Yeah, yeah. The tension between deferral and politics of the city beyond the scope of our team. Beautiful. Lisette, so clear, so simple. Let our communities, at the very least, be involved authentically in the analysis of their own data as part of moving towards people having full ownership over. And we are at time. Thank you all. Thank you for your work, for being part of this community of practice. We'll make sure to save this chat and send back some of these gems of wisdom that folks are sharing. Equity requires continuous work and effort. True equity is redistribution of power. And that happens at every stage of the process. And the reality, those in power may not want to share that power. And so that's where the building of grassroots power is so necessary. And we'll send you all the slides as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rosa. We're going to share all of this with the participants. Thank you all for being here. This is like a great foundation for the sort of rest of our year together. So we hope you continue to join us on our monthly calls, and we will definitely be sending all of this wisdom out in a follow-up email. And also for those of you still on, if you know of community-based organizations who don't have access to GEM yet, the access is there for free. Please get in touch at equitymaps.org. We will hook it up. We will make it happen. There's demos so folks can learn how to use it. So the resources are there. We want to get this data to people. So please talk to us, and we'll make it happen. And we'll get the data into the right hands. So thank you again, Rosa, for all of your wisdom and your leadership here. And we hope to catch you again soon. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rosa. So wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.